Israel's Iron Dome anti-missile defense system is well known, but there's a lot about it that we don't know. We never actually saw it in action in Israel, but we did see the missile batteries on many occasions, and they have greatly increased since our days in Israel. What most people don't know, that in the last 3 years, Palestinians have shot 10,000 missiles from Gaza into Israel. 10,000 in 3 years. And we don't hear those stories in our news over here, but this is a very, very serious defense mechanism which Israel has developed pretty much on their own. In fact, they have given and sold some of the technology to Americans, and we have developed some ourselves. But for instance, there is a shield over Tel Aviv and major cities that is comprised of a laser beam system, and triangulates so that when a missile is shot, and this all has to happen within seconds, the spot is identified and a missile is shot off to intercept that missile and explode it in the air, and preferably not over the top of where people are living. So it has to happen out there somewhere. Every one of those anti-missiles costs $25,000. So you can't just go shooting them off willy-nilly. In fact, they have areas where, because there is habitation on the other side, they've got a solid shield. But if it's going to go over here or over there, they let it go. No reason to shoot it out if it's not going to hit anything. That's just one level. They also have a couple other levels of the Arrow anti-missile system, and most of this is top secret, so I don't even know what to tell you about it, except I know that one of those systems forms something of a laser dome over populated areas, so that if a missile comes in, it hits that dome and bounces off and bounces out into the Mediterranean. And some of that was already in use during the first Gulf War. So there are numerous layers of this Iron Dome system, but every time I talk to Uri Eden, my good friend in Israel, and I just talked to him 2 days ago about what's going on over there right now, every time this subject or similar things come up, he says, but you know what? This is not our defense. This is not what we depend upon. And I was interested as I was getting ready for the sermon tonight and looking for some pictures like this to show you that I found this in a Jewish publication. This is Israel's Iron Dome. And that's what Uri constantly repeats. We do everything we can in our own protection, but ultimately our defense and our dependency is upon God. Well, guess what, folks? Psalm 4 tells us exactly that again. And it has some wonderful applications to us. In regard to these two Psalms, Charles Haddon Spurgeon said, when you go through a trial, the sovereignty of God is the pillow upon which you lay your head. And so the sermon tonight is how to go to sleep at night. And I got into it a little bit this morning as we talked about the possibility, the ability, in fact, the necessity of laying our head down on the pillow and sleeping, because we do indeed depend upon the Lord for our protection, for our defense, and for the watch care over us that only He can give. Psalm 3 is a morning hymn, if you look at verse 5, and this one, Psalm 4, verse 8, indicates that this is an evening hymn, and many have seen that comparison here between the two Psalms, and much of what we'll take a look at tonight. Now, this is another Mizmor, or Song of David. If you look at the opening there, it says a Psalm of David, but back up just a little bit, and we've got some new details here. This is for the Menagen, the choir director, the song leader, the choir master. We know that it's somebody that is up there in the leadership, and it has to do with it being a song. And it gives us one other detail, which in English was translated for us on stringed instruments. That's probably accurate, but we don't always know what some of these instruments exactly are. And this is one of many psalms that have some kind of musical annotations at the beginning. Sometimes it gives you a tune to which it can be sung. Sometimes it gives you the instruments that should be used. Sometimes there are specific directions to a part of the choir, or in this case, the choir master. And those are part of this as an original hymn book. And we're going to pick it up in what in English is called verse 1, but in fact in Hebrew is verse 2. Answer me when I call, O God, of my righteousness. You have relieved me in my distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O sons of men, how long will my honor become a reproach? How long will you love what is worthless and aim at deception? But know that the Lord has set apart the godly man for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Tremble and do not sin. Meditate in your heart upon your bed and be still. Offer the sacrifices of righteousness and trust in the Lord. Many are saying, who will show us any good? Lift up the light of your countenance upon us, O Lord. You have put gladness in my heart, more than when their grain and new wine abound. In peace I will both lie down and sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me to dwell in safety. Now, I suggested this morning that the presence of Selah there, especially at the end of Psalm 3, verse 8, may be an indicator that these two psalms originally were, or at least are intended to be read and used together. That annotation might be a musical annotation. Most commentators will suggest something like pause a little bit and think about it, but it may say something like notch the tune up a little bit, or increase the volume or decrease the volume. But the way that these two psalms are composed and the contents of these two psalms would seem to indicate that they are very, very closely linked. Now, what we find here in the opening verse is that David prayed to God for help. And it begins here. I wrote down he requested God's assistance. But you know what? That first phrase, answer me, is actually an imperative. David's telling God what to do. Now, I would imagine that the tone of voice was not a prideful, commanding sort of tone, but probably something like, answer me, O Lord. Remember that David is calling out in distress, and if these two psalms are linked, then the introduction there to Psalm 3 is of some significance in understanding the historical occasion. If this is also at the time that David had to flee from his son Absalom in the attempted rebellion. He begins by saying, answer me, don't withhold your response. And then the next phrase I found rather interesting because our English translations are all over the place with this one. The NIV says, you are my righteous God. But that is not what the Hebrew says. In this case, I can be fairly dogmatic. The NASV, as I read it, is accurate here when it says, O God of my righteousness. Those of you that have studied a little bit of Hebrew will remember when you look at the pronouns, one of the ways to express a pronoun, now you can say he, you, she, it, all of that, but one of the ways is to use a particle of that pronoun and attach it to the noun that's being identified or defined. And that's what we have here. This very clearly, unequivocally says, my righteousness. And it's a construct form. That means you got two nouns together, God and my righteousness. So this is God of my righteousness. It's a possessive. Now that throws a kink into our understanding, perhaps, but I think the way it is best understood is that God himself is my righteousness. I have no righteousness in and of myself, but I am dependent upon God. But that's how true this is. My righteousness is something that God has ordained. This is something of a vindication especially if our historical understanding of this psalm is accurate, as David, though he was king, has been all but deposed, is in dejection and humiliation, fleeing from Jerusalem as his own son is trying to take over his throne. And then notice what David says here. You have relieved me in my distress. Now, asking the Lord for help seems to be sometimes rather simplistic. This is a good quote from Will Varner, and if you haven't figured it out already, every week I'm reading that little book, Awake, O Harp. I know many of you purchased it, so if you want to know some of the good things I'm going to be saying, you can just peek in there. Will has done a great job of analyzing in a devotional way each of the Psalms. And he says, asking the Lord for help seems so simplistic. But it is the simple solution that we often forget or ignore. If you remember Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, verse 7 says, ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened unto you. Those are imperatives. They're commands in Scripture. This is what we are to do. And how easy it is for us to forget or to not fully believe, to fail in this regard. So David begins here by asking for God's assistance. And in that regard, then, he remembers previous times when God has helped. And that's that phrase then in the middle of verse 1, you have relieved me in my distress. That's gone back to past tense. And it says, be gracious to me and hear my prayer. The word here that's translated relieve, it comes from a root word that means something that is wide, enlarged, something that's open. The path is opened up, so to speak. And that's significant because of the other word in this phrase, and that is in my distress. The word for distress means almost exactly the opposite. It has to do with a tight place, something that's constricted. So when I was in a tight spot, you opened it up for me. You relieved me of that constriction. Real relief requires real answers, and David got them. And this is just one of many occasions where David found himself in very tight situations. If you read through the account in 1 and 2 Samuel, there were many instances where he escaped by a hair's breadth. Saul tried to pin him to the wall. Saul chased him through the mountains. Saul came into the very cave where David was hiding. And we have many instances that no doubt were in David's mind when he says, you've done it before, Lord. Please answer me. Please help me now. And so he restates his request there at the end of verse 1 when he says, be gracious to me and hear my prayer. Actually, there are three imperatives here. The first one, answer me. And then there's another imperative here when he says, be merciful. And another imperative, the third one, he says, hear my prayer. And once again, the NIV got that one a little hard. I'll be easy on the NIV there because sometimes these things are hard to translate. But they gave us four imperatives. There really are three. Answer me, be merciful, and hear my prayer. So verse 1, David prays for help. In verse 2 through 5, he makes a plea for his own honor. And that's not inappropriate. We need to understand that God is also concerned with our good standing, with our reputation. After all, his reputation is often marred by a bad reputation or a lack of honor on our part on the negative side. But he delights to honor us. He delights to give us glory. That's the word that's used both here and back in Psalm 3 we saw this morning. So let's take a look here at David's plea. And the first thing that we see is that he recognized undeserved reproach. Now, when I started this, I read it kind of superficially, and I had exactly the opposite here. And after further study, I realized, no, David is saying, I'm being maligned, I'm being reproached, and it's not true. It's not fair. It's not right. Now, here's the clue. In verse 2, he says, O sons of men. So he's no longer speaking to God. He's speaking now to someone else. And if we can understand who those are, it might help us here to put together these middle verses. The construction here is rather strange. B'nai Ish. Ish is the word for man. The first man, Adam, was an Ish, and the first woman was an Isha, a feminine form. So it's a human being, but it's the sons of men. And it's probably intended as some kind of a reference to people of renown. Somebody he's a man. And these are the sons of men. These are honorable citizens, prominent or renowned people. That would certainly make some sense then in regard to the connection with Psalm 3 and the historical occasion here. Now, notice that David says that my honor has become a reproach. Verse 2, O sons of men, how long will my honor become a reproach? The word for honor there is the same word that we saw this morning, kavod. It is used back in verse 3, and the contrast is that honor now has become a reproach. This is humiliation, shame, disgrace. And it fits very well, this picture that we have of David leaving Jerusalem. Many of his soldiers, many of his counselors, even some of his closest friends have gone over to Absalom's side thinking David's lost it. He can't pull out of this one. And they wanted to be on the winning side when the dust settled, and so they had deserted David. And I think David is calling out to them, you prominent citizens, how long is my honor going to be a reproach? How long will you love what is worthless and aim at deception? Now, do remember that this psalm isn't a historical psalm. This is a spiritual lesson, a song that we can learn from and can be applied in many different situations. So whether or not he's calling Absalom a worthless thing isn't the question to be asked right here. We do know that David dearly loved his son, and when Absalom died, he wailed at the sad death of his own son. But notice the terminology that is used here. You love that which is worthless. We've run into that word now previously also. That has to do with something that is empty, vapid, something that has no value. NIV translated this as false gods, and that's not wrong. There are a couple of places where this appears to be a term that's used for any kind of a false deity that we might set up, but it's a broader term than that. And I think it's appropriate here to use something like is in the NASV, that which is worthless. And the second phrase that we have there is to aim at deception. In other words, how long are you going to keep going after delusions? Don't you know you can't win? Now, that would be, I think, a valid question to ask of Hamas, even tonight in what's going on. This afternoon, 10 more Israelis were attacked with knife and rifle, and one killed in the bus station in Beersheba. It's happening 3, 4, 5 times every day, all week long now for going on 3 weeks. They can't win. At best, this is a mosquito bite for the country. It hurts. It's terrible. But it cannot bring down the nation of Israel. And even if you don't believe in the Bible and the message of Scripture and God's choice and care for his people there, you have to realize this is following deception. Their leaders are leading them astray in this. very similarly here, what was going on with David and what often happens with us. Often the opposition, the persecution, the criticisms that we receive are really just foolishness. And the sooner we recognize that and the sooner we understand that God is our iron dome, the easier it is for us to handle that. But at this point, David is directly speaking to these enemies, these sons of men that have been opposing him. Now, in verse 3, I think, although he continues to address those people, you can sort of detect a change in David's own attitude. He adjusts his own attitude by verse 3. But know that the Lord has set apart the godly man for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. He adjusts his own attitude here, and it's interesting how much he uses the name Yahweh. Capital L, capital O-R-D, is an indicator of that divine name. Notice it's twice here in verse 3. It appears again in verse 5, verse 6, and verse 8. This is the equivalent of calling out the big guns. This is Yahweh who is defending me. How foolish can you be to think that somehow you can turn that over? In fact, he says here in verse 3, beginning of verse 3, know it. Know that the Lord has set apart the godly man for himself. And without a tinge of personal pride in this, David is saying, I'm that one that God has chosen. You can't beat me. Not because of me, but because of God's sovereign choice here. Know it. Now, notice the phrase here that he is set apart. My mind immediately went to the word for holy or make holy, and because we know that that's what holiness and making something holy is, setting it apart for God's use or for some sacred purpose. But that's not the word that's used here. This isn't a derivative of kadosh. The word that's used here means to deal differently, to make a distinction. And that, I think, is of some significance even for us in personal application at this point. Yes, there is certainly a truth found in many places in Scripture that God chooses for himself those instruments he wishes to use. He makes them holy, sets them apart. But this is a different word. This is more the concept of God makes a distinction. He does make a difference between people. Again, there is no room for pride for us. No place to say, we are the ones. This is a cause for deeper humiliation if, in fact, God has set us aside and chosen us. And notice it says very specifically, he has set aside the godly for himself. The word for godly here is hasid. If you're familiar with Jewish people and Jewish concepts, or if you've lived in New York or someplace like that, you've heard about the Hasidim, the righteous ones. This is a term that they've chosen for themselves and not always very applicable in the way that they live, which would be said of any of us. But this is a biblical term for someone who pursues righteousness, runs after godliness, seeks to live a holy life. It has to do with effort on the man's part in pursuing these things. God has set apart the Hasid for himself. How beautiful is that? He wants to have this kind of a relationship with us as human beings. That's inconceivable. There's no way to explain that. You have to just fall on your knees and thank him for it. And notice the last part of that line, he hears when I call. Now, very strongly implied in that, he doesn't hear when I don't call. And that's what this psalm is largely about, to call upon the Lord, to seek his help, to trust in him. and he indeed hears when I call. So David adjusts his own attitude here kind of midstream, and then in verse 4, I think I see him quieting his quick temper. You remember this morning, the third point? God is my striker. The end of Psalm 3 indicates that I don't have to do this. God sees, and he takes care of it, and he does a far better job than I can. I would botch it every time. So it does not depend on my strength or my retaliation or my vindictiveness. God will, in fact, fight my battles for me. And so he quiets David's temper here in verse 4. Tremble and do not sin. Meditate in your heart upon your bed and be still. The word for tremble means to quake. Really, just like our English word, it's shaking. Now, a lot of times we will do just that, won't we, in our anger? I've seen people so mad that they're quivering. But notice the phrase here, quake because of sin, because of attacks against you, because of fears, whatever it is, but do not sin. Do not retaliate. It's interesting that this verse is quoted in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, and you're probably familiar with it there. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26, be angry and yet do not sin. And then this is the Greek form of what we read here in Hebrew. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. It's a kind of a paraphrastic quote in the second half of that verse of what we have here in Psalm 4. Now remember, David is still addressing these sons of men, these opponents. He is no doubt speaking to himself throughout all of this as well, but he hasn't begun to speak to God again just yet. So when he says, tremble and do not sin, meditate in your heart upon your bed and be still. The word here for meditate is really just a very simple word, speak. This isn't, again, one of those fancy words, about, regurgitating the cud like a cow and, chewing it again and meditating. That's not the word here. It's just the word speak. But notice what it says, do this in your heart. Say it in your head. Ponder it. Think about it. Run it over again and again and again. Meditate on these things. And I think it's rather interesting that it says to do this on your bed. That's a good place to do it, isn't it? And in fact, we do that an awful lot. Many times in a negative way. We think through the day and we think of all the things we said we wish we'd said differently, like calling Isaac Isaiah in the morning service, or and sometimes they're far worse mistakes and they bother us, and we can tremble at our own foolishness sometimes. But it says here to meditate, to think upon this in your heart, to go over it in your head without sinning, and do this on your bed, and then it comes to that phrase, and be still. Now that's where we mess up a lot of times, isn't it? I'm really good at the thinking it over all night long sort of thing, but to lay it aside, be still, trust in the Lord, and to allow him to be my confidence, my protection, my iron dome. Meditate on your bed and be still. The word there for still is like hush, or maybe very similar to our word, shush. That can be used very appropriately sometimes, right? Mom always was shushing me. Phyllis shushes me sometimes. There's a good time to be shushed. And that's kind of what David is saying here. On your bed, just shush up. Lay it aside now. There's another interesting thing here before we move on to verse 5. In that last phrase, all of the verbs and all of the nouns are plural. Now, once again, remember that he is still speaking to those sons, plural, sons of men, those renowned citizens, even though he is no doubt reflecting on his own life, his own responses, and he is telling them now, in your hearts and upon your beds, the pronouns are plural here. Now, in verse 5, he turns this to trust, and this was where he was headed from the beginning. He is pulling these people along with him because he's been addressing them, but now to verse 5 he says, offer the sacrifices of righteousness and trust in the Lord. There's a good Hebraism right there. Sacrifice, sacrifices. That would be redundant in English, but it's very common in Hebrew to take the same verb and a noun that are based on the same cognate. He's still addressing the sons of men, but he's describing his own practice. And even as we saw in the psalm this morning, this was a common occurrence in his life. This is one of the reasons why David was not just effective as a leader, but such an example to us. He was a murderer, adulterer. He did just about any sin we could possibly imagine. But he repented, and he repented again, and he repented again. And every occasion he turned back to the Lord. There's some hope in that for us, isn't there? We might not be murderers and adulterers, but we've sinned and we know it, and we've done the same thing sometimes over and over. We need to do as David did. This is why he was such a friend of God, because he confided and trusted and went to the Lord and was quick to repent and return to his trust in the Lord. So he turns it to trust here in verse 4. And once again, we've got an imperative there, trust in the Lord. But it comes as the result of obedience to 4 previous imperatives. Tremble, meditate, be still, and offer or sacrifice. Those were all imperatives too. And therefore, he can say, trust in the Lord. Trusting in the Lord takes that as its definition. Doing right, being obedient, following God's commands, pursuing righteousness. There is a great deal of activity called for on our part. And you know what I'm going to say next, right? That's not legalism. That's just good old-fashioned obedience. God demands and requires that. You can't fish out under that one. You've got to be obedient and follow the Lord and do what he says. And he's happy to bless the man who follows him. Now, David praises his helper in heaven, verses 6 through 8. Many are saying, who will show us any good? Lift up the light of your countenance upon us, O Lord. You have put gladness in my heart, more than when their grain and new wine abound. In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me to dwell in safety. Once again, David begins to address the Lord. And the first thing that he has done at this point is to get things into the right perspective. Now that phrase, many are saying, at the beginning of verse 6, is the same phrase that we saw this morning in Psalm 3, verse 2. And a very similar kind of lesson for us in that. I referred to without reading it, so let me read it now. The very interesting parallel that we have in Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 5 through 8. Then Sanballat sent his servant to me, Nehemiah speaking here, in the same manner a 5th time. That would have a tendency to wear you down. A 5th time with an open letter in his hand. In it was written, it is reported among the nations. People are saying, and Gashmu says, so he actually names a source here that would be some kind of an authority perhaps, that you and the Jews are planning to rebel. Therefore you are rebuilding the wall. And you are to be their king according to these reports. Remember, he's the cupbearer to the king way back over there in Susa. And he's been sent here with a task and with a timeline. Interesting that the king, didn't ask him other details but he just wanted to know, when will you be back again? He depended on him and trusted him. And what part of that trust was, he's not going to go over there and raise a rebellion and overthrow the king in that part of his kingdom. So they're really attacking at a vulnerable spot here. You're going to be the king, according to these reports. You've also appointed prophets to proclaim in Jerusalem concerning you. A king is in Judah. Make it biblical here. Quote some Bible. And now it will be reported to the king, we're going to tell him, according to these reports. So come now and take counsel together. They're inviting him down to a plain, a spot just inside of modern Tel Aviv, about where the airport is today, called the Plain of Ono. And Nehemiah says, oh no, I ain't going there. This is what he says on this occasion. Then I sent a message to him saying, such things as you are saying have not been done, but you are inventing them in your own head. Just shut up. Well, I added a little bit there, but that's the gist of what Nehemiah says. You're just making it up in your own head. Sometimes we need to respond that way too. When rumors get started and false things are said, and sometimes foolishness, sometimes the best thing to do is just respond very straightforward and clearly. That is a lie. That didn't happen that way. That's not true. Put it to rest. That's the polite way to say what I said before. Now, here's another question, though, and I did touch on this morning when it says many are saying. The question is, who are the many? And how many? In Psalm 3, there is some indication. It says there are myriads. In this case, we're not told, but I think we can safely conclude that at least some of them are these guys that he's just been addressing. Oh, sons of men, you special citizens, you high society people. These are detractors and skeptics. It could very well include also some dispirited followers. There might have been people included here that had some pretty honest questions about, can David really do this? Another little hint here for us to remember from time to time is vox populi is not necessarily vox dei. Sometimes the majority is not right. So whether we've got a small little majority in the Supreme Court or a bigger majority in our American society that makes decisions such as that, we are to oppose it. We are to fight against it. It is wrong, and we are not to obey it. And we may have to pay whatever penalty or price there is involved in that, but we need to shout out, speak down, talk bad about such things. Or we are denying our own testimony, our own purpose for being placed in this place at this time. Vox populi is not vox dei. If you have, this is a good one for your kids. If you have 1,000 bad guys, 1,000 thieves, and one policeman, who's right? It's not the 1,000. And just because many were saying it doesn't make it right. Now, this results in another request on the part of David. He says, lift up the light of your countenance upon us, O Lord. And that should ring another little biblical bell in our minds, because that is a very close quotation of what is known as the priestly benediction. In Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26, the Lord, and the word is Yahweh there, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. And here's the quote, the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. This, on David's part, is a request that the fullness of God's divine favor would be directed toward him. So, secondly, he recognizes here an occasion for praise. He's already done that. He says, you have helped, you have restored me, you have raised up my head. And now he says again, you have put gladness in my heart. Now, that's just the opposite of what the many were saying. This is hopeless. It's bad. There's no joy here, no salvation, no deliverance. And David says exactly the opposite. You've put gladness in my heart. Before his prayer had changed his circumstances, it had already changed his heart. And you know what? Prayer has a way of doing that, doesn't it? When we bow before the Lord, those circumstances start taking on their true perspective, and we begin to recognize God's sovereignty and power over any and all circumstances. And our heart is changed so that we can have gladness in our heart. The comparison that he makes there at the end of that line is more than the joy that would come with grain and wine. And remember, this is an agricultural society. These are people who depend on the rain to break up the soil and then to water the crops so that they can have a sufficient harvest, so that not only can they supply their own needs, but they've got a pretty limited agricultural field. They've got to have enough extra grain and enough extra wine to sell and trade for those things which they can't raise locally. So this is of great value and importance when he says this is greater than a wonderful harvest of grain and grapes. And then he finally says that he has actually experienced God's peace. The word for peace is shalom. And, your first encounter with that in Israel, it's kind of funny because they say shalom when you come. They say shalom when you go goodbye. They say shalom when they pick up the telephone. Everything's shalom this and shalom that. In fact, the common expression, how you doing, is ma shalomcha, how's your shalom? And it's used in many different ways, and that might give you the impression that it's kind of a light term. Absolutely not. Especially in the biblical context, this has to do with fullness, completeness, not lacking anything. And that's what David says, that you have provided everything for me. Full provision, nothing lacking. In peace, I will both lie down and sleep. And once again, that's a good combination, right? No good just lying down. You have to come to the point of being able to rest in the Lord and sleep. I will both lie down and sleep because you alone, the only God that can give a calm contentment even in the fire of adversity. And notice it says here, you make me to dwell in safety. The word for dwell is actually the root word to sit. And that sounds strange to us, but an inhabitant is somebody who sits in that place. You live there. You're there all the time. You're fixed there. It's the same word here. You dwell in bitachon. The police have their own little sign on their backs, and the soldiers have their own sign for the Israel Defense Forces, but the security forces in Israel have this word, bitachon, written on the back. And it's this word here, safety, security. You make me to dwell in security. Remember the historical context here. How could David be saying this except for his utter and absolute trust in the Lord? Spurgeon wrote a little poem about this. He says, "Thus, with my thoughts composed to peace, I'll give mine eyes to sleep. Thy hand in safety keeps my days, and will my slumber keep." I've referred previously to the story of two Puritans, actually just barely after the time of the Reformation. Nicholas Ridley was the Bishop of London, and Hugh Latimer was a good friend of his, also a minister. They'd been driven out of London by Bloody Mary and stripped of their privilege to preach or teach or have any kind of a public gathering. They were in prison in Oxford, and on October 15th, 1555, 450 years ago, almost to the day, they were burned at the stake. And we've often used, it's frequently cited, a quote from Latimer, where he says to his friend, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out. And indeed, for several hundred years, that testimony rung true. The Catholics were driven out. The Protestants resumed power. But far more important than any kind of a religious combat was the spiritual awakening that came over the land of England. Sadly, that candle is not burning very brightly today. But did you know that the night before, Ridley's brother offered to come and spend that last night with him in the prison? And Ridley refused, saying that he wanted to go to bed and sleep as quietly as he ever did in his life, saying, quote, I will lay me down in peace and take my rest, for it is thou, Lord, only, that makest me dwell in safety. The next morning he was chained to the stake down in the town ditch in front of Balliol College. And as the flames rose, he exclaimed in Latin, In manus tuas, Domini, commendu spiritum meum. Domini recipi spiritum meum. And then in English, for all of us, Lord, Lord, receive my spirit. I wish I could be sure that I could do that. I'm not so sure. As the flames licked around him and it got hotter and more painful before finally mercifully going unconscious, this was his testimony. I can lay down and sleep because I have an iron dome that nothing can penetrate. Lord, thank you for this wonderful example and promise that we have here and from David's life, and so many applications throughout Scripture with other individuals, and a great encouragement to us as that great cloud of witnesses is cheering us on and telling us we can do it too. We wonder at times if we have what it takes. So help us to turn to you in our distress, in the difficulties that we face, and to remember, as David did, how great thou art, how you are sovereign and able, always in perfect and absolute control. And we can trust in that. We can know your bitachon, your security. Thank you, O God. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, I think the appropriate phrase there is vaya con Dios.